Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It gives me great pleasure to open this this meeting. This is a co-sponsored seminar. I ask everyone to turn off their microphones, please, because we're getting background noises. Thank you. So it gives me, my name is Anat Rosenthal. I'm from the Department of Health Systems Management at the School of Public Health at Ben-Gurion University. And I'm also a member of both the Center for Global Health and the Center for Health, Humanism, and Society. So it gives me a great pleasure to open this joint seminar of the Center for Global Health and the Center for Health, Humanism, and Society at BGU. And we have a very special guest today. Our guest this afternoon is Professor Nicholas V. King. He's an associate professor in the Biomedical Ethics Unit and the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health at McGill University. He directs the McGill Policy and Data Science Program, and he studies the way that black boxes of all sorts, from seemingly objective measures of health and health inequality to complex algorithms, are shaped by human interest and hidden value judgment, which in turn shape individual decisions, collective behaviors, and public policy. Professor King has published in the Milbank Quarterly, Annals of Internal Medicine, BMJ Plus Medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, and the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. No less important to me, and for the sake of full disclosure, Nick was one of my postdoc supervisors, and I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. So it gives me an enormous pleasure to have Nick talk to us today about weaponizing uncertainty in the COVID-19 pandemic. Following Nick's observations and talk, we will have two responses, one from Professor Manfred Green and one from Professor Yaela Shiloni-Dolev. So the order of business is going to be first Professor King presenting for about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, and then we would have the two brief responses, and we will open the floor for questions. So Nick, the floor is yours. You're also a co-host, so you are welcome to share your presentation.
That working right now?
Yes, perfect.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Anat. And I want to thank you and Nadav both for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak to the Center for Global Health and the Center for Health, Humanism, and Society. It's a real pleasure. And to everyone who's on the call, hello, bonjour, shalom. It's really my pleasure to be here. What I'm going to present to you today, it's not a sort of formal, well worked out argument. It's a series of observations that I've been working through that basically are helping me to try to organize my thoughts around some of the things that I've been seeing happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, and trying to both sort of tease out some of the background roots for why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing, and offer a few very, very preliminary ideas on how to combat some unfortunate things regarding the weaponization of uncertainty. And I'm really looking forward to hearing both commentators and also any comments from anyone who's on the call. I'll start with telling you three very, very brief stories that I'm calling snapshots regarding the politics and in some cases the weaponization of uncertainty. And you may or may not be familiar with several of these stories. The first story concerns infectious disease modeling, which is very, very prominent these days, possibly more prominent than it ever has been. One of the most prominent models and modelers is Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London. Ferguson is a former physicist who got into infectious disease modeling about, I think, 15 years ago, rose to prominence with some models around SARS and MERS, actually overestimates of SARS and MERS. And then when his group released a series of models in March of this year, around March 16th, he was widely credited, or those models were widely credited for basically giving the recalcitrant leaders of the United Kingdom and the United States, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, a kick in the pants and finally instituting measures recommending social distancing, isolation, and so forth. And it was these models which forecast in Great Britain the possibility of hundreds of thousands of COVID-related deaths, and in the United States, potentially millions of COVID-related deaths if nothing was done, that really seemed to sound the alarm. Ferguson very quickly was the subject of pretty incredible and intense media scrutiny. And as he revised his models as time went by, that scrutiny very quickly turned to criticism. As you can see from the Telegraph headline in the bottom left here, the Telegraph, a British sort of right-leaning newspaper, published an article talking about how his science, his models had been criticized as flawed in the past. But also he received criticism both within and outside of the administrations in the UK and the US when he revised models in light of the new countermeasures that were being taken in both countries, and felt the need to take to Twitter to defend himself. Where he said, "I think it would be helpful if I cleared up some confusion that has emerged in recent days. Some have interpreted my evidence to the UK Parliament as indicating that we've revised our assessments of the potential mortality impact of COVID-19. This isn't the case. If anything, our latest estimates suggest that the virus is slightly more transmissible than we previously thought." We're saying his revisions were not indications that he had made mistakes, but were indications to address the dynamism of both the virus and the response to the virus. Later on, Ferguson pretty famously was forced to resign from various committees and advisory boards that he was on after it came to light that he had broken quarantine to go see his mistress across town. Well, Ferguson wasn't the only infectious disease modeler who made a big media splash and then faced very rapid criticism. Oh, and here's some of the criticism covered in the Washington Post regarding the US, where they said Fox News host Laura Ingraham wrongly stated that Ferguson's testimony, his projection had been corrected, and that some of Donald Trump's advisors were quoted and then quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that because of the revision, it raises serious questions about the radical countermeasures inspired by public health experts. So Ferguson wasn't the only person who faced this. Another very prominent model was put out by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, Washington. The IHME, which is headed by Chris Murray, is a large institute financed in large part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that in some ways is most famous for housing the Global Burden of Disease study, and is run by Chris Murray, the architect of the Disability Adjusted Life Year and the GBD. And they had put out a series of models themselves, but their models, which were also often referred to by the White House in planning countermeasures, were also roundly criticized and were seemingly subject to continuous revision. The reason for the revision is a bit in the weeds. I'd be happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But essentially, they wound up with a certain amount of egg on their face, and the White House very quietly deleted, or sorry, the CDC, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, deleted the IHME models from their website as reliable references. A third infectious disease modeler who rose to prominence was Mark Lipsitch at Harvard University, arguably one of the leading infectious disease modelers in the world, who published his infectious disease models as preprints on medRxiv, and was contracted by the US government to also advise and provide modeling advice. And he also was taken to task by right-wing commentators, and in fact, Deborah Birx, one of Trump's main advisors regarding infectious disease modeling and COVID. And like Ferguson before him, he took to Twitter to defend himself from this kind of criticism. My second snapshot concerns the work of the clinician and epidemiologist John Ioannidis. So early in the COVID-19 epidemic, right around the time that Ferguson was publishing his first model on March 17th, Ioannidis published an opinion piece in Stat News, which was titled "A Fiasco in the Making as the Coronavirus Pandemic Takes Hold. We are making decisions without reliable data," where he argued essentially that none of the extant models of COVID-19 were reliable enough to provide forecasts on which we could take the dramatic, what he called the drastic or radical steps that many, if not most, countries that were experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic were taking. He basically argued that just as in the clinical world, we want to apply a sort of precautionary principle and not intervene too stringently unless we have very, very strong evidence. In the world of public health, we shouldn't take radical countermeasures that might themselves lead to more harm. He was immediately rebutted by Mark Lipsitch, who I just mentioned, who in a very polite but firm counter editorial the next day said, look, we do in fact have enough evidence from the models that we have and our experience with other coronaviruses and other infectious disease to go ahead and act decisively. Ioannidis, about a month later, stirred up another controversy when he was one of the main authors, along with colleagues at Stanford, Eran Ben David and Jay Bhattacharya, of a preprint looking at antibody seroprevalence in Santa Clara County, California. Long story short, what they argued in this preprint was that the coronavirus, the COVID-19, was orders of magnitude more prevalent in this county than previous estimates seemed to indicate. But they didn't stop there. They alluded in their preprint, but also stated quite plainly in a lot of media appearances, that because the COVID-19 virus was more prevalent on a community basis, the radical countermeasures that had been taken were likely not quite as necessary because the case fatality rate was much lower than we might have predicted. That is, because the virus was not as deadly as we might have thought, we had much less to worry about. And in fact, COVID-19 was likely no more deadly than many other diseases and health problems. And again, that the countermeasures that were being taken would create more harm than good. This story blew up to a certain extent. First, it blew up on Twitter. And here I'm showing you graphics from a great New York Times story that shows that shortly after this preprint was released, the Twitter sphere started retweeting it en masse, but not just any Twitter sphere, two sort of distinct communities of people. The larger community of people was right-wing commentators. So the first tweet happened very early on the 17th when what they call provocateur and sort of conservative gadfly Alex Berenson shared the study. It was then taken up by several Fox News commentators, Lisa Booth, Britt Hume, conservative radio hosts, Reddit's R Conservative subreddit. And you can see that this preprint, and I should emphasize here that, you know, epidemiological preprints don't usually get this kind of quick Twitter following. It really exploded on Twitter. And it exploded on Twitter in a kind of set of communities where you have a very small, tightly woven web of echo chambers in which a single interpretation dominates. It also, in a much more drawn out way, was shared among researchers where you had sort of robust debate over the study. And very quickly, the study was critiqued for a number of reasons. It was critiqued for methodological flaws. It was critiqued for relying on an antibody test that was itself flawed and possibly threw up a large proportion of false negatives, and it was eventually revised. To my knowledge, this hasn't yet actually been published in a peer-reviewed literature. But another way that it blew up was that Ioannidis and several of his colleagues made the rounds of the media. But again, they made the rounds in particular of the conservative media. So Ioannidis himself went on Tucker Carlson's show, a conservative radio show hosted by John Fredericks, and then on Laura Ingraham's show. And then he was later interviewed for a very long-form interview by a set of documentary filmmakers who then released it on YouTube and called it Perspectives on the Pandemic, and it formed part of a sort of conspiracy-laden narrative regarding COVID-19. Later on, it came out in a BuzzFeed news story that a whistleblower complaint had been lodged at Stanford University that alleged, number one, that many of the methodological flaws that have been mounted against the preprint were known to the authors and were very concerning to a number of their colleagues, so concerning that several of their colleagues removed their names from the author list. And also that the authors had failed to disclose funding from a number of sources, including the founder of JetBlue. Now, why would the founder of JetBlue fund a study on COVID-19? Well, this particular founder, guy named Neilman, had 1 week before published an opinion piece where he said the COVID-19 countermeasures are too stringent, they're causing too much economic harm, we need to pull back. And in his Daily Wire, and the Daily Wire is a conservative website, he specifically talked about Ioannidis and his colleagues and the work that they were doing. So it's very clear that Neilman, in addition to funding the study, had been in close contact with the authors and had been apprised of their findings a full week before they actually released it. My third snapshot concerns two individuals, Dominic Cummings and David Hockney. Now, Dominic Cummings, a close advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as you may know, very recently was in the news for, like Neil Ferguson before him, breaking his own government's strictures on travel. So he and his family traveled several hundred miles across the United Kingdom and visited several hundred places, even after his wife and then later Cummings had been diagnosed as carrying COVID-19. And Boris Johnson has, to a certain extent, defended him. I bring this up because I was looking at a letter that was written to The Guardian, castigating Dominic Cummings' actions as damaging public trust. And I happened to notice that this letter, which was written by a sort of laundry list of health professionals and ethicists in the UK, immediately below it, it was a letter by the painter David Hockney. And Hockney was apparently really pissed off about a comment that had been earlier published in The Guardian, which had taken him to task for extolling the benefits of smoking. And I thought this was really interesting, and I went to that comment in which the author talks about how Hockney, who has been a smoker all his life and has long been a critic of nanny state interventions to try to reduce smoking, had recently been giving interviews where he was talking about reports that seemed to indicate that smoking might be protective for COVID-19. And this really piqued my interest because I knew exactly which study that they were talking about without even following the links. They were talking about another preprint which had been released by a number of folks from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, including Ben Goldacre, who, like John Ioannidis, is a longtime critic of some of the flaws in health research, where they looked at a whole bunch of risk factors related to COVID-19. And in their adjusted models, it appeared that being a current smoker conferred a protective effect. And this actually was reported fairly widely in the news media. You may have seen reports of it. Well, the problem with this is there were two mistakes in this reporting. The first is that the authors had fallen prey to a kind of methodological problem called collider bias by adjusting for multiple factors, including risk factors that they themselves were interested in. And that readers and reporters had committed something called the Table 2 fallacy, which was misinterpreting a descriptive study as implying causation. And here, if you want to learn more about either of these, I would refer you to Ellie Murray. She is a fantastic epidemiologist at Boston University who puts out what she calls tweetorials, where she describes some of the fallacies in these papers and their coverage, and also likes to illustrate them with stills from The Princess Bride, which is near and dear to my own heart. So I gave you these snapshots because I think they illustrate what I call the weaponization of uncertainty in disputes over the proper place of scientific evidence and expertise in policymaking and public life. And when I say weaponization of uncertainty, I mean something very simple. Uncertainty is not just a fact of life. It's a fact of, it's something that we have to deal with in science and research, and in particularly in health research. And a lot of the best aspects of good research are very transparent about uncertainty. They acknowledge the necessity of understanding and quantifying uncertainty, both in conducting research and in communicating results to the public. Uncertainty is weaponized when critics take this transparency about that uncertainty, turn it around and use it as a means, usually in service of some kind of political ideology or some other kind of interest, not just to criticize the individual studies, but to criticize the place of scientific evidence and experts, ideally scientific experts, in public life. It is taking what is often a virtue of scientific analysis and turning it into a sort of cudgel to be used to beat against scientific expertise. Now, there are a number of tactics that people who weaponize uncertainty use. And I just want to run through a few of these. These are by no means exhaustive, but I think they're important. And they illustrate to a certain extent how this weaponization is both novel in some ways, but draws on very deep historical roots regarding the weaponization of uncertainty. And I know there are several historians on the call, including my friend Negev, who has been looking at uncertainty and the weaponization of uncertainty for at least 150 years. I don't mean he's been doing it for 150 years, he's been seeing it being done for 150 years. So I think there will be some obvious resonances. So the first tactic is to require impossible levels of certainty and cast doubt on one's opponents when they can't provide it. And this tactic, again, it has deep historical roots, but most recently in the past 30 or 40 years, this is a tactic that has been honed and deployed over and over by different industries as a way of forestalling scrutiny of what they're doing and regulation that might curtail their activities and their profits. So this includes things like the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, and a number of other industries that manufacture harmful products. There have been a number of books written. This is by the historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt, and a more recent one by a former Obama administration official turned journalist called The Triumph of Doubt. And we see this most obviously in the climate change sort of debate, where there's a pretty unprecedented broad scientific consensus regarding the reality of climate change, and yet fossil fuel industries and opponents of climate change keep moving the goalposts and raising the bar and demanding almost impossible levels of certainty about climate change. And every time a prediction is seen to be slightly wrong or a revision is slightly done, they will say, aha, because there's a little level of uncertainty, we can't trust anything that climate scientists say. As an unnamed British American tobacco executive stated as far back as 1969 in a famous memo, doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. We see this now in COVID-19 when modelers who are very good about determining and communicating uncertainty and about revising their models to take account of current events are castigated, not only, and who are said that they are, because they're revising their models, this casts doubt on the whole enterprise of policy based on their predictions. The second tactic is to amplify doubters and discredit critiques of the possible conflicts of interest that those doubters might have. So another way of putting this is the old Fox News saw of fair and balanced reporting, where when despite an emerging consensus around something, what interested parties do is they amplify the marginal voices of people that support their preconceived biases or interests. There are many, many examples of this. I already mentioned JetBlue's founder funding and getting in touch with Unitas and his colleagues. Another example is the sugar industry as far back as the 1960s. Bankrolled research into dietary fat and its role in coronary heart disease research. And in this case, rather than saying, well, work on sugar is wrong, they found something that might contradict work on sugar. That is, instead of holding sugar accountable for obesity and heart disease, holding fat accountable for heart disease and pump money into those studies. What's really important about this is I call it amplification rather than conflict of interest. Because when we think in terms of conflict of interest, we're really trying to stare into the hearts and minds of authors and say, well, did Unitas and his colleagues have a conflict of interest? I don't know. I can't know. What I can know is that powerful interest groups will find positions that support their own interests, and they will amplify those voices to the extent that they have as great a media presence as others. And another thing that they will do is, so in this case with JetBlue, David Neeleman, the founder, has a particular perspective and some ideas and some thoughts. Unitas told BuzzFeed News, I don't know exactly who were the people who funded the study eventually, but whoever they were, none of them really told us it should be designed in a given way or done in a given way or find a particular type of result or report a particular type of result. So this is the second part of this tactic, which is discredit critiques of possible conflicts. So when Unitas was confronted with the fact that his study had been funded, he basically said, well, maybe that's the case, but it didn't result in a conflict of interest for me. Again, this isn't about generating a conflict of interest, it's about amplifying. Here's another response from Unitas's co-author, Eran Ben David, also said that no donors had any influence on whether Neeleman's contributions were a potential conflict of interest that it should have been disclosed. He said, well, everybody has an interest, including the National Institutes of Health. And he added, what if I told you you had supporters of Hillary Clinton funding the study? What difference would that make? So this is turning around the critique and basically deflecting it and saying, look, just because I've been amplified doesn't mean that this matters at all. So a third tactic, which has roots much more in the wider political sphere, is to claim certainty and celebrate authority over facts and expertise. And clearly Donald Trump is one of many populists and sort of right-wing politicians in power these days who has honed this to a fine art, where he essentially claims absolute certainty when challenged with facts or the recommendations of experts. He celebrates his own authority and claims over those of experts, and he finds a willing set of sort of followers among his political followers. Let's remember that almost literally the first act that Donald Trump did after being elected president was to claim that 1.5 million people came to his inauguration, more than any others in history. And he did so despite photographic evidence showing that his inauguration certainly didn't attract as many people, probably not even half as many people as the Obama inauguration. And when he was confronted with these facts, he kept doubling down. And he made his advisors also double down on this lie. So on January 1st, Press Secretary Sean Spicer had to say, after being confronted with this photographic evidence, this was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration period. And then the next day, Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway very famously went on Meet the Press and said, in defending Spicer, "You're saying it's a falsehood," and there, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts. And that's where we have the now common term alternative facts has come from. This was the first salvo in an exercise of power, the power to celebrate demagoguery over expertise. And here I want to direct your attention to an essay that appeared in 2016 by my colleague Jacob Levy, a political scientist at McGill, where he says this exercise of power is extremely important in consolidating the kind of control over authoritarian tendencies that Trump exhibits. Saying something obviously untrue and making your subordinates repeat it with a straight face in their own voice is a startling display of power over them. It's something that's endemic to totalitarianism. And here he references Hannah Arendt, who very famously said, "The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as lie, but the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. The ultimate purpose is not to promote the specific lie, it is to cast doubt on truth and falsity and make sure that power resides in the authority rather than the experts." And what this also means is that in the public arena, when medical experts contradict these powerful political leaders, they are subject to widespread criticism. A corollary is that even as one is proclaiming certainty, one practices a continual politics of uncertainty that deflects criticism and accountability. Says, I know exactly what's going to happen, but constantly changes, floats trial balloons, backtracks, so that they can never be accused of actually and never held accountable for anything in particular. And when I was researching, after I came up with the title Weaponizing Uncertainty, I of course Googled that term to see if anyone else had written. And really the only thing I found was this one thing about Donald Trump's trade policy, where they say, actually what Trump's trade policy does is it weaponizes uncertainty in international trade in this manner. A fourth tactic is to model defiance of expertise. And this is even as one is a leader and is promulgating policies and countermeasures, to model defiance of those countermeasures. And again, the purpose of this is primarily to show the predominance of the authoritative figure who has the power to do whatever he or she wants over the experts who are advising them. So we see this in Dominic Cummings' behavior. We see this in Donald Trump's behavior as well. A fifth, which I'll mention, is to sow and amplify uncertainty from the outside. So we see this clearly in Russian interference in elections around the world, also Russian interference in anti-vaccinationist debates. And the important point here that these two stories show is the point of this is to amplify and magnify uncertainty, not necessarily to promote one particular point of view. It's to promote uncertainty around vaccines or uncertainty around an election, not necessarily to elect a particular person or come down on one side or another. A sixth tactic, probably the most obvious one, is just to lie, to obfuscate, to prevaricate, manipulate, or suppress. We are seeing this in multiple jurisdictions around the world. I have examples from the United States where a number of states are clearly manipulating data to support early reopening. And again, like in tactic 5, I want to stress here that the point here is not necessarily the short term of the individual lie or manipulation. It's the longer term production of what Hannah Arendt was talking about, which is a certain kind of politics of uncertainty. And one of the ironies here is that sunshine doesn't necessarily disinfect if the ultimate goal is greater distrust of experts and government experts. Manipulation actually plays into this politics of distrust. And we can already see the results of these tactics coming to fruition. There's not yet a vaccine, but the anti-vaccinationist sentiment around a potential vaccine is in full swing. In Canada, where luckily I think I can say we have had much less outright obfuscation or manipulation of data, there is nevertheless increasing worry that the Canadian government is hiding something. And then I'll also show a tweet from an MD sort of complaining about working on patients who are experiencing multiple systems failure from COVID while having to still convince them that it's not all a hoax. So these tactics come to fruition and have real world impacts. So I'm going to conclude by offering a few thoughts, and these are really just preliminary thoughts, on how we counteract the weaponization of uncertainty. And my thoughts are in some ways, I guess, counterintuitive, because the immediate answer that we usually have is to double down on certainty, to trust the experts, to convince everyone that they need to trust experts more. I don't think that is necessarily useful, and in some ways it might be counterproductive. So I have a few suggestions for ways to counteract weaponization of uncertainty. The biggest one, I think, is to reduce the demand for certainty. Uncertainty couldn't be weaponized if there wasn't an underlying demand for certainty. Well, who wants certainty? Well, a lot of people do. We do. So individuals want certainty. Uncertainty is difficult. It's psychologically damaging. It's hard to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. It renders seemingly simple decisions complex. And as the entire field of behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, led by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, have shown for a number of years, humans don't do well with dealing with uncertainty. I'd say also that our information ecosystem, the global information ecosystem, really demands a lot of certainty. Certainty sells. The proclamation of a prediction that tells you exactly what's going to happen in the future sells. It's a great media moment. It activates powerful, both positive and negative affective responses. And with a 24/7 media cycle, often facts which take a long time to amass, there's not enough facts to fill up the day. So what we have is takes. We have certain proclamations and judgments. Finally, decision makers crave certainty. They crave certainty because they really are terrified of over and underreacting to things like a pandemic. The famous swine flu fiasco in the United States in the 70s, the WHO reaction to the influenza in 2009, which both were criticized for dramatic overreactions, are still sort of fresh in the memory of a lot of decision makers. And certainty also helps decision makers project control and confidence. And the idea of decision makers who are controlling and confident is often seen as it's a particularly male trait and is seen as strong, powerful, authoritarian leaders. I'll just make a plug here for the fact that some of the best responses worldwide have come from some of the politicians who didn't actually project these images, but actually really embraced uncertainty. So for example, in New Zealand. And here I'm talking about Charles Mansky's book, Public Policy in an Uncertain World. I think it is possible to counteract this by, and this is a long-term process, educating people on how to tolerate uncertainty. So in the medical profession, there has, in some ways, in reaction to evidence-based medicine, been a push for tolerating uncertainty both among doctors and patients. And in the policy arena, Charles Mansky has written pretty extensively on how to communicate uncertainty in a productive manner. A second thing, or one part of this, I think, is reforming the overall information economy by encouraging robust debates and saying that robust debate is a feature, not a bug. So when we see debate, when we see revision, this is not an indication of flaws and mistakes. This is an indication of the scientific process being worked out, but we are seeing it in public more and more. And I think that in the information economy, we should report and normalize uncertainty more and say uncertainty is a feature, not a bug. So we should be saying that, you know what, this kind of debate is actually a good thing and we should let it play out. When we write editorials, we should say there isn't one prediction, there are best case scenarios and there are worst case scenarios. And this is actually an opinion by Nicholas Kristof, who I rarely agree with on anything, but I thought this was actually a pretty good opinion piece. This is from recent reporting in Montreal looking at models. And again, it's a very, very good evocation of how to look at different modeling predictions given different baseline conditions and the sort of range of possibilities. Now, one thing I want to say here, you may have noticed that a lot of what I was talking about in those first three stories revolved around preprints. And I've seen some people suggesting that the problem is preprints. It's that we're getting too much stuff out before it gets peer reviewed. I have to admit I'm on the fence about this. I do agree that preprints, it's all too easy to have wild and dramatically methodologically flawed speculations out there. But I don't think that the peer-reviewed literature is the answer. One of the interesting things is that Ioannidis, among many others, one of the progenitors of meta-research, has shown that the peer-reviewed research often suffers from just as many flaws. And one thing about peer-reviewed research is that I call it a certainty engine. Because what you often see in publications is a good evocation of uncertainty during the methods, but the conclusions also produce a kind of certainty. So here are two examples. This is a randomized controlled trial for edoxaban for a new treatment, a non-inferiority trial. This is a global burden of disease study from the IHME on alcohol. If you look at the tables and the figures, you see p-values, you see confidence intervals, you see nice confidence intervals, you see quantifications of uncertainty. But if you go down to the conclusion, you see proclamations of uncertainty. So the evidence about edoxaban was mixed, but the conclusion is it is non-inferior and it's safe to prescribe. There's certain confidence, there's uncertainty regarding alcohol, but the conclusion is that the best amount of drinking is none. Absolute certainty. Second is to break the cycle of amplification. And I must confess, I don't know how to do this. I'm just observing that so much of what I've been talking about is particular individuals whose voices are dramatically amplified, and they're often amplified because very powerful and deep-pocketed sponsors sponsor their research, whether it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whether it's JetBlue's founder, whether it's the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So the Laura and John Arnold was a former Enron executive who started a foundation that actually gave the seed money to start the Metrics Institute that John Ioannidis started up at Stanford. So all of the people I've been talking about have very powerful and deep-pocketed backers. A third is to promote the values of science, particularly transparency and accountability. And here I draw on sort of my background in the history and anthropology of science. Often we want to double down on expertise. Yeah.
Nick, I'm sorry to barge in, but we are at 40 minutes and I know
okay.
we have 2 comments, so I'm very sorry to rush
Yep.
you. Okay.
Yep, no, I can finish. I'm so sorry. I can finish in about 2 minutes. Great. So I'll just quickly run through this. So we often think that we should promote people to sort of blindly trust experts because they can be relied on to be objective and not value laden. But as Naomi Oreskes, the historian, has said, actually this is wrong. What we should be embracing is a lot of the values inherent in the scientific process. And I'll point in particular to humility, a dedication to honesty and integrity, transparency about uncertainty, and continuous revision of findings. The The final thing I'll say, and this may seem counterintuitive, is to encourage tolerance of uncertainty and judicious skepticism of incredible certitude. Despite the fact that there is a lot of motivated skepticism out there, I think it behooves us as educators to continuously teach about the value of skepticism and not to promote blind faith in experts. And I'll sort of end with a mea culpa. I have for years been teaching a course to fourth-year medical students called The Crisis in Health Research, where I have taught a lot of John Ioannidis's work. It's one of the reasons why this came to fore with me, and I will still continue to do so because I think it's really important that we teach professionals, producers, and consumers of information about the corrosive impact of incredible certitude and motivated skepticism. I'll conclude with two quotations. The first is a quotation from the political scientist, Robert Davies. He says, "The facts have never appeared out of nowhere, but are a product of careful institutional design, which might now need refreshing or reforming." It's not about the facts, it's about the political institutions that we have. And I think that this moment really indicates that we do need to refresh and reform those political institutions. And finally, I will put up here a tweet from my colleague Jacob Levy, who was responding to other events in the world regarding the protests around the police brutality in the United States and elsewhere, where he said, "I don't think people should have very confident views about the political effects of any particular protest tactic, and certainly not anything like property discussion or setting fires. Sometimes they incite backlashes and reaction. Sometimes they successfully put the relevant powers to be on notice. If your confident prediction about these political effects closely tracks your view of the moral status of those actions, arson is attempted murder, chain stores steal from their communities, blah, 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 it's a very bad sign. Own up to your evaluation of the means without unwarranted confidence about how it will all turn out." I think those are great words to live by in science as well as in the wider political arena. Thank you. Merci. Toda. Sorry for going on for longer.
No, thank you, Nick. This has been fantastic. When we started talking about these ideas a few weeks ago with Nadav, we thought it's going to be very relevant. And then these 2 weeks happened and it has become even more relevant. So thank you for this and thank you for showing up. We now have two commentators to respond to Nick's paper. The first is Professor Manfred Green. He's the director of the International MPH program and previously the head of the University of Haifa School of Public Health, where he's a professor in the Department of Epidemiology. He previously served as head of the public health branch for the Israeli Defense Force, as well as the funding director of the Israel Center for Disease Control. So Professor Green, floor is yours.
Thanks, Anat, and thank you, Dr. King, for a really fascinating talk. I think you covered a huge ground, so I'm not even sure where to start to respond. I'll have to be very selective because I think if you need to give me a couple of hours to go through all the points because you made a number of incredibly important points, and I think each of them virtually deserves a separate lecture. So maybe I'll just make a couple of comments. One is that I think it's very clear to all of us that when there's a crisis, there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum of people who are actually, if you want to call them, the real experts. And what happens is that many other people step into that vacuum, and that creates sometimes chaos. The second is that we talk about transparency, and I think it was Sandman when he spoke about risk communication saying that the public is very concerned that the authorities don't share with the information that they have with the public. But they're even more concerned that the authorities actually don't have that information. So there's a kind of a conflicting view here as to, what is actually the problem. I think that what we've seen, particularly in COVID-19, is, and I guess it's what we'd say history repeating itself. We keep going over the same things. But what we are seeing is that we are, as you say, looking for certainty, and the public is always looking for certainty. And I'm sure you have that in all of us when the public asks us, when is this pandemic going to end? Or when is there going to be a vaccine? And if you say to them it's not clear, they're unhappy with their answer. They're much more happy with somebody who says it's going to be in 3 months' time or it's going to end in 7 months' time. It's not quite important as to whether that number is correct. They like the idea that they have some certainty. So that's another issue here. The last point I'll make, and if we have time, obviously we can talk some more, but I don't want to take up too much time. I would want to focus on the modeling part of it. You're all familiar with it, and models are pretty much only as good as what you put into them, and they really are extrapolation of almost physical conditions to human behavior and biological conditions, and that's not really a very good fit usually. It can't really cope with the uncertainty. And so the modelers, as they've described it, there's the famous statistician Box said that all models are wrong, but sometimes useful. It's true that a model gives you an extra tool, but I think that people are inclined, as you've mentioned, to see that as giving you an element of certainty. So the model says there are going to be 10,000 cases. The model's wrong when there are only 8,000 or they're 15,000. Well, the model's not really wrong. The model is doing what it can do, and that is to give you a ballpark figure on the basis of what you have at a certain point in time, and so on and so forth. And it's very flexible. So I think that's the. I want to just really finish with one comment. But I follow carefully also Ioannidis' his comments. On the one hand, he tries to gender skepticism, but I'm always impressed how certain he is that everybody else is wrong. So he's not at all skeptical about the fact. I think he's published a paper saying that all research is wrong. So, I think that we need to be cautious. Also, I'm not criticizing him in particular, but I think one of the final things that is problematic is that we tend to use this opportunity to basically criticize our colleagues. So it really means that whatever one of our colleagues says, we'll be ready there to tell everybody that person's wrong. He's not as good as I am. I can see all the faults and so on and so forth. And I don't think that does service to the public. Okay, that's all that I have to say now. Let's the next speaker.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank you
very much.
Professor.
I very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. The next response is from Professor Yaela Shiloni-Dolev. Professor Shiloni-Dolev is a sociologist of health and illness at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She is also a member of the Israel National Bioethics Council, and her areas of interest and research include new reproductive technology, genetics, gender, and bioethics. Yael?
Hi, everybody. I have some problems with my internet connection. So I have my laptop next to me, and if you don't hear me, give me a sign and I will move to the other.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you. So I have some thoughts, sociological observations, which I wrote down about flaws and distrust. They don't all have to do with the uncertainty, but maybe with other reasons of distrust. When my kids were young, I used to read them a book teaching them how to count. And the book, the pictures showed, for example, 1 fish, 2 flowers, 3 dogs, and the like. But the last page, which I mostly loved in this book, said there are things you can't count, like mommy's love and the smell of the ocean. This is true also for models. There are things they do not or cannot calculate. The most fundamental question today, I think, is what is this all for? Why are we protecting life? What are we living for? Is it pure survival or a meaningful existence? Those questions seem to be almost illegitimate right now. The argument is between those who want to protect the economy or freedom. That's not how it's posed in Israel, but in the States, as I understand it, and those who want to protect life. But what is it concerning life that we want to protect? What is essential for meaningful life? It is supposedly easy to count how many die or how many are unemployed, but how do we calculate not being able to smell the ocean or to hug our beloved grandma? How do we count the effect of being locked down in an elderly home with no free choice about the risks you're willing or unwilling to take upon yourselves and others, or the stress of being locked down with a violent partner or dying in quarantine with no one holding your hand. Even the things we do count are obviously problematic. How do we decide about categorizing information and turning it into knowledge? What does it mean to die of corona? If you're 85 with multiple background problems, are you really dying of corona? Does questioning this is a form of ageism? Another question is, what kind of comparisons are used in our models? Was it, for example, right in the Israeli case to compare ourselves with North Europe or North America, but not with closed Mediterranean countries like Greece or Egypt, where the virus never hit so hard? How does cultural imagination, like fantasizing that Israel belongs to the West, affect our models? Or our culture understanding of the military as our great savior? Unfortunately, the way that virus is perceived, especially here in Israel, but probably not only here, is dominated by the language of war, which obscures many important aspects of the epidemic and the correct ways to handle it. We constantly count the infected, the ill, the critically ill, but behind those quantitative measures pointed at life itself and their inherent limitations, other factors, even easily countable factors, are still not seriously taken into account. How does the virus affect different groups in society? Young and old, rich and poor, men and women. In Israel, the crisis was up to now handled mostly by a small group of health experts, physicists, and also by the army and secret agencies. The social sciences, with all their enormous knowledge, which is highly relevant, are not among the small group of experts who are in charge of national policy, and so are women in general. But are the models, as Professor Green said, used in physics, apt for taking into consideration biological entities like viruses and social entities like human beings, whose behavior has an enormous effect on the spread of the virus? In the tradition of many feminist writers who study the metaphors used to discuss illness, I want to remind us that the virus is very different from a human enemy. The language of military lockdown, surveillance, victory, and surrender is not actually relevant. Moreover, it comes with costs. As the virus seems to be here to stay for a long while, we better start speaking the language of adjustment, of learning to live side by side, of adaptation, instead of the language of defeat. Otherwise, how will we handle the next infection or approaching crisis or wave? So my question is, can our models help us do that? Do they suit the mission? And I hope I was not using weaponizing tactics, just sharing my worries without any interests.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nick, would you want to respond?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you both for those amazing comments. You both said a lot of things. I'm just going to pick out a couple things to respond to. Dr. Green, I agree with you regarding the vacuum, about the sort of garbage in, garbage out models, and models only being useful in some cases. I think the whole question around sharing information and lack of information is one incredibly important point that you've brought up. One of the slides that I glossed over really quickly, I'll share it again, is this, where I'm pointing to now at this point in the epidemic, what we're seeing in Canada a lot is a debate over sharing of information by public health authorities, and different provinces are sort of choosing to share certain amounts of information, and they're very worried about two things. They're worried about moral hazard. They're worried about if they tell the population that the rates are going down, that they will stop practicing social distancing. And while I understand that, I think this is one case where in public health, we need to understand that transparency can really create trust. And that, as we're seeing, as you say, if less information is being given out, that can be counterproductive in the sense of people will either see it as withholding the information or as the information simply not being there. And I'm reminded of sort of debates in public health for years, if not decades, where uncertainty is often demonized by people who want to project a certain sort of Manichaean interpretation of the world. When information came out about the complexities of the relationship between mortality and obesity, some researchers at Harvard actually went in the media and said, we can't let this complexity get out there because people are essentially will misunderstand and they will no longer see that obesity is simply bad. And I think we should have a little more trust in the public around that. And finally, I really agree with, I think, one of the spirits of your comment, which is, it's not necessarily the models, it's the claims that are being made on the model's behalf. And it's sort of the claims to certainty. Dr. Shaloni Dolev, amazing comments. I think we agree on most everything. I really agree that a debate, perhaps the debate we should be having, is not about the numbers themselves, but about what kind of lives we want to have. I think what happens is often, instead of having those debates, which are very difficult and can't be solved with quantifiable evidence, we deflect onto debates over the quantifiable, measurable evidence that's available. And instead of having the difficult debate of what kind of lives are worth leading, we say, well, what does the model say? If it was correct, that gives us one decision. If it was incorrect, then that decision would have been wrong. And so I agree with you. I think we need to be having those other debates. And there's a sort of frustration with, again, if you claim that the quantifiable models are useful and give you certainty, that shifts the terrain of the debate away from the things that really matter. Can our models help to do that? I think they can. I think they can by giving us two things. Number one, establishing kind of parameters, best and worst case scenarios, so that we don't fill the vacuum with either positive or negative fantasies of either utopia or dystopia. But I think the second thing that they do is they can ideally give us all a kind of shared frame of reference and model, I don't mean that as a pun, but it is, model the idea of not constantly always being at loggerheads and having to, and I agree with the feminist critique in a always portray absolute certainty, but have the possibility for debates that understand the role of uncertainty. And I will stop there, but thank you so much both for your comments. Very, very helpful and illuminating.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. We are just over the time. So it was a fantastic presentation, and thank you very much for the responses. And we will be happy to share Nick's email if you have questions, if that's okay with you, Nick.
Absolutely, please do. And if anyone has a question, I can stay on the line for a couple more minutes as well, but I'm also always happy to get emails.
Okay, well, that's very generous. Thank you for joining us. I wish we could host you and take you out to dinner now here in Israel, but I guess that would have to wait until the next visit.
Well, I know I've been talking with you for years and Nadav for decades about coming to Israel, and I'm bummed that it's had to be virtually instead of, so I will take you up on that offer because I've always have and would like to come.
Yeah, so invitation stands for where we can actually host you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, the Centers for Global Health and for the Center for Humanism for co-hosting this seminar. And thank everyone who joined us. It was fantastic to see you all. And I can't wait to actually see you all at some point in the near future, I hope. Okay.
Thanks to all of you.
Likewise.
We can
Thank you
clap
so much.
hands.
Thank
Nick,
you.
it was amazing as usual. I have millions of questions, but we'll do it probably in another time.
Over
We have
coffee,
another
over
Canadian
coffee.
here with us,
Yep.
Dr. Moriael, and she's working on evidence-informed decision-making and knowledge transfer that has a lot to do
Awesome.
about what you presented. And it's interesting how the Canadians are doing this knowledge translation.
Yeah.
Much better than in many other countries. But that's another topic.
Absolutely.
Nick, it's Maria. Your talk was great. I texted Anat in the middle that we should require each of our PhD students to listen to the recording because I think it was amazing.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks again, Nick. I'm sorry I need to go off again to another Zoom, as they say. We go from Zoom to Zoom.
Thank
About a
you.
life I didn't
Thanks
want.
very much indeed. Okay, thank you
Thank you
all.
so much for your
Nadav, we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Manfred.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Toda.